what exactly is rewilding? Rewilding is a difficult one to strictly define, and perhaps that's why it's so exciting, because of how vague it is. But despite this ambiguity, we can sort of intellectually orient ourselves by considering some of the principles of rewilding that inform rewilding projects across the globe, no matter where they are. To some extent, these principles will inform these rewilding projects. But first, let's consider general things about rewilding that make it so unique and exciting. So firstly, rewilding is all about employing and using the power of megafauna to set an ecosystem on a trajectory towards self-regulation. So it's all about using megafauna, their ecological functions, to direct or guide the progression of an ecosystem towards a place where that ecosystem is now self-regulatory and needs zero human management. So the likes of horses, wild horses, rhinos, the likes of elephants, bison, these megafauna, which we can loosely define as organisms who, when fully grown, weigh over 45 kilos, or alternatively, we can define them relative to all the other organisms in their surrounding ecology, and they are the largest, relative to all other organisms in that ecology, the largest of all of them. These are the megafauna. So rewilding is all about reintroducing those megafauna to re-establish the functions that those megafauna once fulfilled in that ecosystem, that made that ecosystem dynamic and self-regulatory. Secondly, rewilding is a means by which we people of the future, that's like young people and even old people who just care about the future of humanity and this world, it's a means by which we people of the future can prevent and reverse the continuation of the degradation of our natural world. So we get to actually enhance biodiversity and increase the biological vibrancy of the natural world. That's why it's so exciting. Rewilding. It's a mechanism by which we can do that. So it offers an enticing vision of the future that pulls people in. And this is one thing about rewilding that I find so fascinating. It's as if rewilding as a concept is an open niche full of space. So it has yet to be sort of colonized by the species that will exploit that niche. And individuals who happen to tune into this open niche and connect to it, what happens is this open niche elicits only the best out of them. It demands the best out of that person who has connected to this open niche. And so it will push that individual, not just intellectually to their limits, but also emotionally and even physically. Like you can imagine just going out on an adventure to some rewilding project and it being arduous but rewarding. So rewilding is that for some people too. It's that open niche that will call forth the best from you in so many different aspects of your life. So that's why it's so exciting. It's an enticing vision for the future for both society and the individual. So let's get to it, let's get on it, let's crack on. Some general principles of rewilding that will inform rewilding projects across the globe to some extent. First one, the first principle is shifting baseline syndrome. This is an interesting topic. So what shifting baseline syndrome is, with each new generation, they first encounter a nature that has been altered somewhat by the generation before them. The generation before them doesn't notice the slight alterations that they made to the nature that they first encountered, because it's so incremental that it's imperceptible to that older generation. So now this new generation first encounters this slightly altered nature, and going forward, when they grow up, this is the nature they seek to protect and conserve, because this is their reference, their baseline nature. When they now have kids, the new generation is exposed to, again, a slightly altered nature. So slightly altered that it was imperceptible to the older generation, but it nonetheless has changed. And so this new downgraded version of nature is this newer generation's baseline reference nature, which they will seek to protect going forward. And again, it will happen with each generation. There's a downgrading of the nature, because this is just in the ways we humans interact with nature currently, today. Nature happens to be downgrading as a result of the consequences of our actions. So we can dive deep into that. That's another topic for another day. But the important point here is that each new generation considers the nature they first encountered as their reference baseline nature, and this is what they will seek to protect and conserve. But this is a wrong way to view nature conservation, and what rewilding is all about is considering the multiple natures that will have been made manifest in a certain geographic location across geologic time. So rewilding considers those past natures. So maybe 1,000 years ago, how did this nature look in this particular geographic location? 10,000 years ago, how did it look? And where was it the most biodiverse? Because if we just simplify it to, let's try and make natures as biodiverse as possible so that they can become self-regulatory and require zero human management. If we just simplify it to that goal, then we want to see where this nature in this particular geographic location was the most biodiverse, and then seek to emulate that nature going forward so that it sets it on a trajectory towards that self-regulation that it once had. That's what shifting baseline syndrome is, and that's how rewilding considers or casts its eye back across the multiple natures that will have occurred in this specific geographic location. So connected to this is the idea of Megafauna Pasts. Now this is a chapter in this book which I would highly recommend. It's a fascinating read and it's a really good just summary of what rewilding is all about. Rewilding, the Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery by Paul Jepson and Kane Blythe. It summarises rewilding very nicely. The authors did a great job at just a broad overview of what rewilding is. So in this book there's a chapter called Megafauna Pasts, and this again is connected to the notion of shifting baseline syndrome, and it's so fascinating. Megafauna used to be far more prevalent in all ecosystems, like terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems, freshwater aquatic ecosystems. They were everywhere. And because of this shifting baseline syndrome, we humans have forgotten that megafauna used to be such a prevalent force. And we've actually sort of, through agriculture and domestication, we have kind of replaced the functions of megafauna in certain ecologies, but elsewhere the megafauna have become extincted or extirpated, locally extinct, and their function hasn't been replaced, so those ecosystems are downgraded as a result in terms of biodiversity and biological vibrancy. So what rewilding does is, again, considers the past natures, the functions of the megafauna, because there's this intense debate over the cause of megafauna extinctions, which is again another topic for another video essay, but the debate is between climate, was it climate change that did it, or human-induced megafauna extinctions. This is beside the point. The point is the megafauna functions have been extincted. And so rewilding seeks to re-establish those functions, because those functions are so crucial to an ecosystem reaching a point of self-regulation and indefinitely long self-regulation into the future. So it is like the true version of sustainability. How can we re-establish those functions so that this ecosystem, without human management, can continue functioning as it does for ever? Megafauna pasts. Again, comes back to that loose definition: over 45 kilos in body weight when fully grown. Horses, rhinos, elephants, mammoths. Obviously, mammoths we're not going to reintroduce into ecosystems because they're fully gone, but we can reintroduce proxy species. These are species that fulfill the same function. They're different species, but they fulfill the same function. Similar functions, if not the exact same function, as mammoths once had. Now, connected to this idea of megafauna pasts is the idea of disturbance regimes, and this is why the function of the megafauna is so important. Not necessarily the exact species, but the function, so proxy species. The function is these megafauna maintain ecosystems, at a regional scale, at a continental scale even, if given the space. They maintain ecosystems in a dynamic state of equilibrium, as opposed to a static state. So here we're going to have to just quickly consider the concept of the Clementian climax model. This says that with a terrestrial ecosystem, it's going to progress in a sequence from bare ground to closed canopy forest. So bare ground, grassland, shrubland, closed canopy forest. That's the simplified version of the Clementian climax model. What megafauna do is they come into that Clementian climax model and they maintain land at a regional scale, whole landscapes and possibly whole continents in this dynamic state between shrubland, grassland, forest, bare ground. They're constantly maintaining the continent through their behaviour and how they interact with their surrounding nature, and making sure that everywhere doesn't progress to the closed canopy forest, which is just a single type of habitat, but maintaining heterogeneous habitat across the whole continent. So bare ground, shrubland, grassland, forest ecosystem, they're like the vectors of biodiversity that make sure all other species have the habitats they need to survive and thrive. Vectors of biodiversity. It's a cool concept, but it's because of their behaviours. They knock down trees. They obviously, just because of their sheer weight and massive size of the herds, they're trampling the ground the whole time, disturbing it this way. They wallow, so they dig up they pull back the turf, and they clean themselves in the dirt that they expose. And then certain areas will, just by virtue of the megafauna missing them, grow into the full closed canopy forest, which is itself a habitat necessary for certain species. So they maintain biodiversity by maintaining this mix of heterogeneous habitats across the continent. So some people call them keystone species. But keystone species is a bit misleading. It's a good simplified version for people who are first coming into contact with rewilding. So keystone species evokes the keystone arch. This is a specific type of arch where at the top of it there's a stone called the keystone, and this keystone maintains the integrity of the arch. So this is an analogy for a state of nature. State of nature being the arch, and the keystone species being the keystone at the top of this arch that maintain this particular state of nature. So if we consider a megafauna species as the keystone, without the megafauna species, you take away the keystone, the arch crumbles, it crashes, it falls into rubble onto the ground. And this is analogous to a state of nature downgrading into a less biodiverse version of what it once was. So that's the idea of a keystone species. They disproportionately affect their surrounding ecology, such that the surrounding ecology changes as a result of their actions. But obviously with ecology and nature, it's much more complex. And it's not that one single species maintains this state of nature, but that species interacting with multiple other species is what maintains that state of nature. And I think the best way to illustrate this is to use the classic example of wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, and as a result of their behaviour, the river that runs through the park changed its course. And you think, well, how did that happen? Wolves, in no way, other than like drinking from the river, directly affect a river. And even when they're drinking from the river, it's sort of negligible, their effect on that river, especially the course of the river. Come on, how did that happen? Well, indirectly they did so because the reintroduction of wolves into the park created a landscape of fear for the prey species, the deer, the elk, the moose. All of these large herbivorous prey species had to change their behaviour as a result of this predator being reintroduced, because if they were to graze on the riverbanks for the length of time that they had gotten used to in the absence of predators, they'd have easily gotten picked off. So they had to minimise their grazing time on the riverbanks, because otherwise the predators were going to wipe them out, and retreat to the forested areas where they could hide from the predators, the wolves. And with this, the riparian species that colonised the riverbanks could recolonise the riverbanks. And as a result of their recolonisation, the roots maintained the soil structure of the riverbanks, and so the river couldn't run such a meandering course. It had to narrow its course, and it ran a tighter course. And this being the result of the reintroduction of wolves. So that just is an example of how it's multi-species interactions that disproportionately affect the surrounding ecology, as opposed to just the one species that the analogy would imply. So just to finish this off, rewilding is part of this paradigm shift in how we humans interact with the natural world. So it's like a mechanism that's going to bring us from the old conventional ways and transition us to the new, fully shifted way of interacting with nature. Right now we're in the transitionary period, so it's a bit chaotic, but I think through rewilding we will find our feet and figure out the best ways by which we can interact with nature, such that the human enterprise can continue, at least in theory, for an indefinitely long period of time into the future. Old school sort of conventional conservationism and protectionism has run its course, and it's too restrictive now. What rewilding does is, again, it offers that enticing vision of the future and an expansive vision of what could be, as opposed to just protecting what is, desperately protecting what is against the inevitable encroachment of the contaminating human influence, which that again is another topic for another day. The contaminating human influence. Humans aren't a contaminating influence. Certain actions that we have gotten used to taking, of course, are unsustainable, but we can shift, and that's what this is all about. We can shift, we can change the ways we interact with the natural world, and rewilding, this is a means by which to transition into that new way of relating to nature. So hopefully your understanding of rewilding has increased somewhat as opposed to decreased. Hopefully that was more clarifying than it was confusing.